they expect the war to go on for at least another 2 weeks, which is uh, really inconceivable given the current situation in Hormuz, because this is causing a huge disruption in the global supply chain. While China is best positioned to weather the storm, there are countries who are heavily depending on the Gulf oil. There's
Yeah.
countries
Not
like
just oil, as we talked about last week, Carl. There's all the fertilizers and other chemical
yes,
products. This is it's a global disaster caused
yeah.
by uh, the United States and Israel.
Yeah, and there are countries like U.S. allies in East Asia, like Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Australia. They're all very heavily dependent on the oil exports from the Gulf, and China, for its part, has already banned export of refined petroleum products like gasoline and diesel. And Australia, for one, depending on 32% of jet fuel from China. That 32% is just gone right now. And to think that this whole thing will go on for another 2 weeks, Japan might be a little bit buffered because they do have a large strategic oil reserve. The other countries, I'm not so sure. It's gonna
Oil reserves, agricultural food production, and are obviously at the front of the impact areas. And but I think this could go on for more than 2 weeks, because in
really,
addition to the transit time for the Marines to even get there, the ability for the United States to continue bombing Iran is likely to go on for a few more months at current tempo. It has the ability to do that. And it'll need to do more than that if it wants to interdict Iranian capabilities and ultimately reduce it. It has reached a point where the Iranians are also leveling out and attacking with a relatively consistent rhythm. And I suspect it's a rhythm that they can sustain from a production and repair, replenishment point of view for a long time. I've seen analysts who estimate that at the current tempo of drones and missiles, particularly some of the shorter range missiles, that Iran can keep this going for years. And the challenge for the United States is that for the United States to keep up this tempo, it's basically delivering much of this at the moment from a distance, and it's going to need to get closer. So as it gets closer, as the planes need to start flying over Iranian airspace, those planes become exposed to being hit by missiles, right? So for America to sustain this, it will need to take greater risks. It doesn't have bases in the Persian Gulf from which it can launch much of its attacks, and so it will be coming from a long, long way away. Last week, Iran took out a couple of airborne refueling planes of the Americans. And again, you start taking out that kind of infrastructure, and the ability to sustain a certain tempo of bombardment diminishes. And without that, the Americans are going to struggle to even try to turn this situation around. I think it's going to be very, very difficult. And where we're heading, an American political scientist, Robert Pape, has talked about in previous research work and continues to talk about it in relation to this particular war, the risk of an escalation trap that the United States has actually created and has entered into an escalation trap. It can't get out of this escalation spiral for fear of not only reputational damage, but actually material power diminution globally. And so it has to keep going. And as it keeps on going, it will take greater risks. It will put the lives of even more young Americans on the line. And that then leads people to talk about this as potentially the 21st century Vietnam for the United States. I mean, we know through the Pentagon files that were leaked that those inside the American state actually knew well in advance that the United States could not defeat the North Vietnamese. And yet, for years after that knowledge, the United States continued fighting this unwinnable war. In fact, a war that they would inevitably lose. They knew this, but there wasn't the political courage from anyone inside the system to actually accept defeat. And so they poured more lives in, diverted more national resources into war as opposed to into nation building, and hoped that they could push the problem to the next presidency. The risk we have now is that President Trump will seek to push this to the next presidency. Now, whether that's viable or not, I think, we can debate about that at the moment. I don't have a strong view at all as to whether or not this war can be sustained by the Americans, even though it can't win, for another 3 years. But the risk with these things, these escalation traps, is that the political dynamics means that Washington will do this. They'll just keep pouring men in, and come up with whatever excuses. The media will, from time to time write something critical, but by and large will continue to create the impression that headway is being made. Surprise, surprise, similar patterns been going on in Ukraine as well. Ukraine's not a winnable war, but nobody wants to actually accept the consequences of initiating the war, let alone wrapping one up, because wrapping one up means accepting defeat.
Well, that's a depressing thought because, what I had hoped, a quick climb down for Trump, because this is what Trump liked to do, is to spin everything as a victory for himself. And then, there were indication of that, when he said, this is not U.S.'s problem. And what happened in Strait of Hormuz is the problem for the Europeans and Asians. Yeah.
Carl,
Go ahead.
let's say he does that, right? Let's view this in a pro-life kind of way, which is that he brings American aggression in this war to a halt sooner rather than later, declares victory and goes. Let's say he does that. Well, what does Iran do? Well, I don't think Iran stops until Iran gets what it wants. Now, what's Iran's concerns? Well, Iran's principal concerns is that the Americans will come back and have another chop later. So that's its first concern. How do you mitigate against that? Well, the Americans say we won't do it again. That's probably not good enough, given the bad track record of American deal making. So Iran will insist that the Americans have no presence in the region. That's something they're clearly pushing very hard to achieve today. What else does Iran want? Well, Iran's also made clear that it wants reparations to finance the rebuilding of cities that have been bombed by the Americans, and to compensate those families who have lost loved ones. Now, how are they going to get that? This sort of doesn't end neatly, just because President Trump says, "Well, we killed the political leader, the spiritual leader. We've taken out the head of security. Job done. Let's go." Well, it takes two to tango, and once you create this kind of a security problem for a state like Iran, it does want to seek a solution to this. Again, we can draw parallels with what's happening in Ukraine, where the Russians, again, whether you like it or not, The Russians have been articulating a view that they have legitimate security concerns and that they want those concerns to be acknowledged and baked in to the agreements and the architecture, right, of a region. Same for Iran now. There will be insistence on a whole raft of agreements, I think, about American basing, in other words, no bases. They will need to have agreements with the Gulf monarchies, because the Gulf monarchies will want to ensure that they've got safe passage for gas and oil. And we're going to see a dramatic change in the security architecture of the region. This is a monstrous defeat, by the way, for the Americans. And this is why just walking away and saying, I've won, is not going to complete the issue. The other thing, of course, is President Trump, in a sense, can say whatever he wants. But if no one else in the world buys the claim that, I've won, well, you've still got the same problem, because everybody can see that the United States has not prevailed in this particular combat, that it has been severely debilitated in some respects. We've all seen reports of the proportion of its arsenal that has been consumed in 3 weeks. Total arsenal. This isn't getting replaced tomorrow. A colleague of mine has been crunching some numbers, and he goes by the name of Policy Tensor on X, and he's been running some interesting numbers and developed some models on the drone warfare dimensions, and he's published those, which clearly indicates that the Iranians can keep this going for a long time, and the Americans are in no position to bring it to a halt. I've actually supplemented some of that, though it's unpublished at the moment, because I don't think the raw data is good enough. But which is looking at the missiles situation, and develop some mathematical models around missiles depletion, interdiction rates, etc. And all of this paints a very grim picture from an American point of view. And so I'm sure that for those who actually have access to much better information, namely the Americans themselves, about their own inventories, the serious people, as opposed to the folk in the White House, the serious people have actually been doing the sums as well. And they know that they are not in a position to keep this going in a meaningful way, with any hope of changing the military trajectory. And the only thing that keeps this going is actually politics, right? And it's the politics of the midterm elections, the politics of a presidency that doesn't want to be responsible for not just a humiliating defeat in a generic sense, as Vietnam ultimately proved to be a humiliating defeat, as Afghanistan was a defeat, etc. But this is potentially actually an era-defining defeat that literally draws a line under the 35-year era of American unipolarity, the 70, 80-year era of the political West, the post-war political West era, and arguably 450, 500-year era of the colonial West. I'm not sure that that's the legacy that President Trump wants to leave behind.
Yeah, which means this war likely will drag on longer than anybody would have hoped for. This is very grim, because the whole world is basically being pushed toward precipitous abyss, and we are it's just on autopilot. But the train is going on autopilot.
I hope 3 things can happen in the short term. One is, given that Iran controls the governor and has clearly been willing to let ships through, that countries will ultimately arrive at agreements with Iran for the safe passage, not just of oil, to keep a lot of this stuff going, because that one's going to be held quite tight. But fertilizers, right? I mean, because in the end, ensuring that the world has the capacity to feed itself matters. And I think from a reputational point of view, it would be in Iran's own broader diplomatic reputational interest to enable that to happen. The second thing I think that I think this catalyzes is actually the acceleration of electrification. It's not to say that hydrocarbons disappears tomorrow. It will continue to play a role, but more effort's going to be made to transition to non-hydrocarbon-based systems. More effort's going to be made to hasten the development of new technologies. Whether it's in, as I said, the renewable energy space, electrification of passenger motor vehicle transport. China leads that. Electrification of freight transport. Come 2030, 30% of China's heavy road freight vehicles will be actually electrified. I mean, that's amazing, because 10 years ago, if somebody said, look, freight transport is going to no longer be diesel based but electric, people would laugh at you. The idea that transport could be dissociated from hydrocarbons was unthinkable 10 years ago, and yet this is exactly what's going to happen. And so we're going to see a lot more of that. So and this is accelerating something that I think was happening anyway. But what country that does not have its own oil would leave itself structurally exposed to future oil risks such as those we're witnessing today? I don't think anybody would do that, given the availability of alternatives. In 1970s, when the first oil shock took place, there were very few alternatives. There are alternatives today. And what that means is that China in particular is in a position to play an outsized role globally, but not in a way that oil-rich countries were able to, because they controlled the upstream. The nature of renewable energy technologies and energy sovereign technologies and energy storage technologies is that once you've got them, other people can't turn them off on you. And that is going to be incredibly attractive to countries around the world, particularly in the global south, but not just the global south. I'll look at a country like Australia, where I am, and Australia is now in the middle of a re-energized debate about what the energy profile of the country looks like in 10 years' time. There are those who argue that Australia needs to build a few more refineries. Others are now saying, actually, we can electrify our commercial fleets within 2 to 3 years if we actually had the political will to do so. Right? But this is a debate that's going to accelerate all across the world. And so, I think we're going to start to see some transitions. We're going to start to see the acceleration of electrification, not necessarily a bad thing. And on the food front, I think in the short term, I certainly hope that the Iranian government will see that it can play actually a constructive and responsible role in terms of fertilizers. But the other thing I think we're likely to see as a result is a change in the way that many places actually think about their food systems and their own agricultural systems that have, over the course of the last 100 years, become increasingly dependent upon these sorts of fertilizers. But again, we have to ask the question, is this system, which has these risks, the kind of food systems that we as different societies want to have going forward? Or do we want to reimagine our national food security in entirely different ways? I don't know where this will go, but these events no doubt will provoke these debates.
Yeah, I have no doubt the entire world will move toward that direction. The question is, can they move fast enough? Before the oil runs out. Because right now the prop there's still, even as Iran is allowing some ships to go through the Strait of Hormuz, I mean, the traffic is still fairly light.
Very light.
Yes,
Oh,
and the
look,
and
think of
you
it.
I know
Just take
UA.
one country. Take one little country as a case in point, Australia, right? Australia has what, less than 30 days of gasoline and diesel. That's not a lot of time. And at some point in time, that if this persists, then available stocks run out. There's already talk now, actually, about whether or not Australia needs to have what's the word? Regulations basically, and rules about who gets priority to use things, and whether it should be prioritized by industry. Rationing is the word I'm trying to think of.
Rations. Wow.
Rationing. There's already talk today. Now, not coming from the government, I might add. The government's trying to play the everything will be okay, we've got things under control position. The opposition, of course, is the Chicken Little. The government's not done enough. It's all going to go terribly wrong. But there are also serious people saying, well, if we've got 25, 30 days of fuel, and if this conflict persists, then at some point we are going to face supply side constraints. And if those supply side constraints become material, literally in 4 to 6 weeks' time, and we can foresee that because it takes a couple of weeks for the ships, 3 weeks for the ships to come through. Well, it's actually very easy to see into the future at what point you're going to start to have insufficient stocks of fuel in Australia. And the decisions will then have to be made about prioritizations in the short term, and then what does the place do medium term, right? And that those decisions, I think, are potentially ones that need to be made inside the next 3 to 4 weeks, right?
Now.
So you
better,
asked
better.
you asked the question, right? Can we solve all of this in time before the oil runs out? Well, it depends on the country. But Australia, as just an example, doesn't have a long lead time on this. Japan has a long lead time. Philippines doesn't. Mainland China has a long lead time. The little province of Taiwan does not have a long lead time. South Korea does not have a long lead time. So that's just our region, right? I think Malaysia is actually a net exporter. So I think it's probably going to have a little bit more buffer, right, as we've discussed before. A place like India does not have long lead times. India's got, not only problems with liquid fuels, it's also got problems on the gas front as well, right? Restaurants are already shutting and having limits placed on them, where you can run your kitchens for an hour.
This is why India went to Washington to ask for a waiver to continue to buy Russian oil and gas. And this is actually why Washington has temporarily suspended the sanction on Russian oil and gas, because even Washington know they need to increase the oil supply to the world. And this is why, when stupid people like Gordon Chan says, oh, why do we allow Iranian oil tanker to sell to China? Well, because even United States government has realized they need to do whatever they can to make sure the oil continue to flow. More Iranian oil goes to China, that means the less oil China needs to buy from elsewhere to free up more oil supply.
Absolutely. The other thing is, the United States also imports oil too. This is the thing that I think all of this talk about the US having lots of oil, it does. is one of the world's, in fact, it's the world's largest producer, really. It is, but it doesn't mean it doesn't import stuff, because there are many different kinds of oils, and to process and distill and things, you do need different kinds of inputs. So the United States also is exposed to the dynamics in a material sense and in a financial sense to the global oil markets. And so, yeah, look, this touches absolutely everybody. And I mean, we've seen gas prices in the US now rise to what, $4 a gallon. And I saw in the last 24 hours data on the average diesel retail price, which has hit just on $5 a gallon in the United States. In fact, it's only the second time historically that it's gone over five. Last time was during the COVID pandemic. So, this is a very substantial spike. I was contacted last night by, out of the blue, somebody who runs a small town depot where they just had diesel delivered, and the new retail price is $4.82 US. So that's nudging up to that average of $5, essentially confirming what's going on. So, United States businesses and consumers won't be immune. And you think about the, households are affected, of course, right? But when diesel prices go up to the $5 mark a gallon, two big industries are affected straight away. One's obviously agriculture. A lot of the machinery, of course, runs using diesel. On top of which, they've got the fertilizer challenges now, right? But the second one is freight. So moving goods around the United States, including food, is dependent upon diesel. And you bring these things together and you've literally got a general cost increase across the board, because everything gets transported, and anything related to food is going to be hit. What are farmers going to do? Are they going to absorb this increase in diesel costs? I doubt it. Right? They're in enough pain as it is, and so we're going to start to see this happen. Now, who are the beneficiaries? Well, there are beneficiaries, of course. President Trump made that very clear. When oil prices go up really high, he says America makes a lot of money. What he means is American oil companies make a lot of money. And we've seen this happen before. During the pandemic, when prices went through the roof, American oil companies made a lot of money. Ordinary households and small businesses and other businesses lost as a consequence, but big oil did very, very well. Again, we've got these dynamics at play. And the American economy is already under a lot of pressure, and these increased transport cost pressures and food production cost pressures are just going to make things worse in the context of a midterm election, right? I mean, this is creating what's the word? A cyclone or a whirlpool or it's a political storm all coming together. And in that environment, what worries me, Carl, is the fact that this war is likely to go on longer than 2 weeks. I can sort of see clearer. Not that I've got a crystal ball or anything, but I think anybody who can exercise their brain can sort of see that there's a good chance this lasts a bit. But who can predict what madness comes out of Washington when these political forces are let loose?
Well, I mean, I'm. It's actually pretty shameful in United States. There's even MAGA factions that against the war, but the Democrats has said relatively little. They have largely stood on the sidelines. It's
Yeah.
the system is broken.
What's so disappointing about all of this is, look, there is no anti-war movement to speak of. That's the first thing,
Yeah.
which, to me, having participated in Palm Sunday marches, in the late 70s and early 1980s, I sort of still have memories of, peace movements and things. But it is that political silence, right, where a political judgment's been made, which is, why say anything when your political opponent's doing so much damage to themselves? But that's not the point. The point is to actually articulate a substantive position, right? Which is that come November, should this still be going on, we will do something about it. And if you elect us, we are going to use the powers that we have as members of Congress to do X, Y, and Z, because this war is a disaster for Americans, first and foremost, right? American reputation globally, secondly, and of course, if America pretends to have any sense of status as a global leader, the negative effects across the world on wealthy countries and poor countries alike, it should be something that an American political class has the guts to say something about. And it doesn't. It doesn't have the guts to say anything about it. They just sit there whilst President Trump acts unilaterally, surrounded by yes men. And when people resign, clearly someone with some capability, this is the counterterrorism bureau head, the first thing that happens is that it gets attacked for being soft. I mean, it's truly remarkable watching this from afar, that a political system actually makes it possible for something to go this far and to go this much off the rails, right? This is why it is a systemic problem. If the system can't bring this sort of irrational, destructive, self-destructive behavior to heal, then what chance does it have? What chance does anyone else have? And I'll go out on a limb. The only chance that people have at the moment, the only chance, like it or not, is to throw a rope and hope that China grabs it and pulls you in tight, because it's the only stable ship at the moment on this crazy, stormy sea.
On that note, I think thank you very much, Professor Powell, for sharing your insights. Every time I have you on my show, I'm always learning something new. If people want to follow you, where would they go?
Yeah, my Substack, warwickpowell.substack.com. Firstly. Secondly, I've just published a book which is available on Amazon. It's called Thermoeconomics in a Time of Monsters. Paperback, hardback, and Kindle formats available. And thirdly, I have my own little special channel, special because it tends to bring voices from the global south to a global audience, on YouTube, TIO Talks with Warwick Powell. So they're the three things. Appreciate it if you followed it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Powell, for making your time to speak to us. And you're preaching to the choir when you say the system is broken. And I know the American system has been broken for a very, very long time now. It just now we're seeing the disastrous consequences, and we'll have to see where this takes us. And so thanks for my audience for sticking with us. Until next time, bye-bye.